Welcome to the VMI Leader Journey. I'm your host, Major Catherine Roy, Communications and Marketing Manager at the Center for Leadership and Ethics. This podcast features conversations with VMI cadets, faculty, alumni, and VIP guests who come to post. Our conversations highlight leadership best practices and insights on leader development. On our show today is the 2023-24 Leader in Residence, retired Brigadier General Christopher Burns. Burns was a guest speaker in Lieutenant Colonel Paula Tucker's leadership class last year, which allowed us to invite him to observe and serve the Institute's leader development programming. His unique relationship development style and insights on developing a, quote, recruitable workforce, end quote, have made him an invaluable asset as this year's Leader in Residence. Welcome to retired Brigadier General Chris Burns. He's made several visits to post, and we're just very excited to have him. Not only has he been very useful here on post, having conversations, engaging members of our staff, faculty, and Corps of Cadets, but we're having this opportunity to sit down and have a bit more of an in-depth, targeted discussion on leadership insights. If you can just introduce yourself to our audience, give them a little taste of your background and what you do now.
Sure. Well, thanks, Catherine, and thanks for the opportunity to do this podcast. I've really enjoyed being at VMI and being a leader in residence, and had, I think learned as much from the cadets as they have from me, hopefully, and everybody else in the faculty. So, my background's pretty different in the sense that I started as a private in the National Guard in the artillery, and then kind of took the traditional path and what I would call the Connecticut mindset, which is you go to high school, you go to college, you get a job. And came along the way, there was a little ad that talked about joining the National Guard. And so I joined the National Guard as an E1 when I was 17, between my senior year of high school. And then I was kind of off and running. It was a 6-year enlistment. They were going to pay for college. It was the Cold War years. I kind of looked at it and said, I always want to serve my country, and this is a way I can kind of do both. So that was my initial motivation. And then my grandfather had worked on Wall Street. I didn't know what that meant at the time, but when I graduated college and went through ROTC at the University of Connecticut, went through my Green Beret training, I started working on Wall Street. Didn't realize it was sales, but I quickly learned and adapted from that, what to do, and became a very successful financial advisor, and then moved into management at the same time, paralleling a career track as a Green Beret in the reserves. And then when 9/11 happened, everything changed for everybody. I was working in the Middle East with Fifth Group as part of my alignment. So I knew when we figured out that we were going to the Middle East, we'd be mobilized. So I was there with Fifth Group. We mobilized with them, and then ended up hitting Uzbekistan in February of 2002. And then pretty much every couple of years was deployed somewhere around the world in terms of countering ISIS and all the various things we had to deal with from that side.
And you were still with the National Guard, right?
Yep, still the National Guard.
Okay.
And yeah, so it was we mobilized for a year and then come back, and I learned a lot in that process. I learned the business principles. You kind of set the foundation up front, and then when I was away, all the success of all my hard work would be there for the person who took over for me, and then I'd come back and rebuild it. But it was a pretty crazy time, and then I got the opportunity around midway, I think around 04, 05, to help develop a high performance coaching program for our company. And that's when I really got the leadership bug. I had it a little bit before that because I had run officer candidate school, but I didn't realize until I got into high performance coaching how effective it could be. So that's where my passion for leadership and coaching comes from. And as you know, working with me, I'm an avid reader in that space and constantly looking at kind of where we need to be from that side. So that's really where my passion came from. So a combination of my military background, my executive coaching, and then just being a successful financial advisor, and then moving up through the ranks on Wall Street, kind of gave me that drive to keep going. And then in 2010, with the mortgage meltdown, I came on active duty, and they kept giving me jobs I couldn't say no to. So I stayed until I retired. as commanding general for Special Operations Command North, which was a tremendous honor for me.
Wow, that's super impressive. But of course, that's kind of what we look for in a leader in residence is somebody with these not only the theory and the study, but the very practical, you were in the trenches kind of background and experience. I think that for our cadets is a sign of some serious gravitas.
Oh, thanks. I was in the right place at the right time. So
Yeah, right, right. So it's interesting that your career kind of flexed in and out of the military duty. Um, and I wonder, with all the leadership reading that you do and your high performance coaching, would you say that you have a good idea or your finger on the pulse of trends, or dare I say, a little bit of a futurist as to what are the coming needs for leadership? And if so, can you talk about that?
yeah, I think the trends are a little bit challenging because we've been in a tough economic cycle for 20 years since 9/11.
Yeah.
So one of the programs that gets cut on the civilian side, and I talked to the cadets about this, are your leadership development programs. So what you have on the corporate side is you have managers who are getting promoted from kind of what we call a tactical management, working at that office level, moving up, but they're not getting that leadership training. And unless you're someone who looks to keep learning, you're not really catching up on that. So you have a lot of managers who need to become inspiring leaders, but didn't really get that training. Now the benefit is the military. We That's part of our core value system. So
Mhm.
just like we run Officer Candidate School, VMI, the institute is focused on leadership and leadership development, and that's really what it's about. And that's the strength I tell the cadets every day when I sit with them, is that your unique value proposition is you're going to be able to be an inspiring leader. Because as you move from thinking about I, just me, myself, who I
Mhm.
am, and then transition to a we mindset as you develop your leadership philosophy, as you move into your leadership roles, you also have to inspire. And that helps make for a very effective leader, both for those cadets who are going into the civilian world or into government agencies, as well as for the ones going into the military. But there's a tremendous gap, because of that lack of leadership and development, where you have people being more of a manager than a leader. And you can feel that, when you look, especially in the corporate world, there's just this kind of lack of inspiration and a little bit of apathy among employees because they're just not inspired by leaders, and it's not their fault. They just haven't been developed, due to the cut in programs, which is unfortunate. But people tend to cut developmental programs when times get tough.
Mhm. Yeah, you and I had a previous conversation, and you were talking about how also the impact of the rapid technology growth that we're having, and we're not able to kind of, my word, marinate in these leadership principles and ideas as we did post World War II through the Cold War years, to say and allow those people the time to develop their leadership insights and principles and then become those inspiring leaders. Um, do you have some insights on how managers might better transition from tactical, I call it like the moving from the production side to the leadership side?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that, and it's the scariest thing, which is you have to realize your success is no longer based on you.
Mm.
And when you're a manager, you can manage your way to success. And a lot of that is kind of centric on you and how you manage and what you do. Whereas when you're leading and moving up in that, elevation to operational strategic, you have to rely on everybody else, which can be very unsettling because you're going from, me as a manager, I can kind of manage this and I can, through sheer force, kind of get to where I need to be. Whereas when you're leading, you have to inspire others to be the best versions of themselves, which then makes the organization greater. Now, the scary part, which I always talk to the cadets, is depending on the size of your organization, that can be anywhere from, eight to hundreds that are all raising that organization that you hope you can give them a common direction to be successful as a leader. But it's no longer about your success. It's about you inspiring them to be successful and see the vision for the organization and drive
Mhm.
it.
Yeah, that was gonna be another question I had is do you think that some of these managers that are struggling or, just not quite getting it, would you say that they have a lack of vision or maybe a lack of ability to communicate a vision?
Yeah, I think it's that, and I've seen that over and over again. It's amazing. And my company I was working for a year and a half ago, I was coaching through a standard of care for our clients, and we had the people talk about what their vision was, but I didn't realize that their staff had no idea what the vision of these people was, and they've been working with for them for 20 years. So it was incredibly powerful for the staff to get the vision from the leader because then they were able to innovate and find
Yeah.
solutions. Say, okay, this is who we're focused on. Let me do a better job in my role now that I know what the vision is. So,
Yeah.
it's a great point. I think a lot of people underestimate the value of articulating the vision to people and they just assume everybody has it.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I can't remember quite how the saying goes, but if you aim for nothing, you'll hit it every time.
Yeah. Yep.
Would you say that this also involves, again, going from that tactical management to strategic management requires a lot of delegation, and there's that aspect of trust that has to happen?
Yeah, trust is critical in the kind of the four elements I would say for a successful team are trust, communication, process, and accountability. And trust and communication are critical for a leader to have that so that way that vision comes out, what we call commander's intent in the military comes out,
Mm,
and kind of having that road that everybody knows they need to move along. And as you move up in the organization, you have less and less control, if you will, because you have more and more people under your
mm,
supervision or command, which means you have to be much more effective as a communicator because you're going to have to give them that vision and that common road to kind of stay on to develop and grow the organization. And that can be hard sometimes if you're not communicating. And we have a tendency in society today to think, oh, we don't need to communicate as much as we do. And
mm.
the common question that's always been asked, which is a great one, is do you ever feel like you're over communicated to? And most people will say no. But we have this natural tendency of, oh no, too many meetings, too many this, and we're not communicating. But if you can communicate more effectively and also using different mediums,
Yeah.
because what you find, and I'm sure you see this, Catherine, um, with cadets, they love texting. Whereas for me, I like a conversation. So I have
Yes.
to use different mediums to reach the population where they're at to be an effective communicator, like the podcast.
Yeah.
This is something, a couple of years ago I would never thought of doing, but it's an effective way to reach a certain amount of the population as we go forward.
Yeah, we definitely use those principles all the time in campaigns or marketing, reaching all, and it makes your workload kind of grow exponentially along with the technology because you're not creating one or two tactics, you're creating a multitude of them. Thank God for repurposing is all I can say.
Yeah, well,
Um,
it's like I used to say when I worked on Wall Street and I would train new advisors around marketing, I would say everything works a little bit. There is no magic bullet. In
yeah,
the old days, you could have this very pithy tagline that would drive, revenue. We don't have that opportunity anymore. Now we have everything works a little bit. So to your point, you have to constantly be innovating and expanding and thinking differently on how to approach things and look at what the effects are.
yeah, yeah. Um, we also talked about previously some of your favorite leadership books, and one of them that you mentioned was about Strength Finder. And so, if you could talk a little bit about why that's one of your favorite leadership books, what people might find if they read that, and then talk about one of your strengths being a woo, because what is woo? It
Yeah.
sounds romantic, but it's not.
Yeah. So Strength Finder, I find to be probably one of the most powerful tools out there in terms of an assessment tool and helping an individual and organization be successful. And the primary reason is because it's focused on your strengths. So if we go back to this idea that keeps me up at night, which is we're moving faster and faster and faster. So we're innovating. we need to be able to adapt and change all the time. So when you think about that, I need the best version of each person who works for me, and the best version is they're working to their strengths. And what Strength Finder does is it'll assess and tell you what your top 5 strengths are. And then the idea being that if I do those things, I'm gonna probably operate over 100%, which as the world moves faster and faster, if I can have you doing that, 1, you're gonna be happier because you're playing to your strengths. 2, you're gonna just be way more effective because those strengths are your native geniuses, the things that you love to do. So you're going to be passionate about them. And if you're passionate about them, you're going to naturally be innovating and thinking all the time about how do I make these strengths of mine even better as I go forward. And then that allows you to go and grow from there. And for cadet, it's incredibly important. I just had this conversation last week in the class because what you don't have yet is a lot of experience. But if you know what your strengths are, then you can kind of focus on your experiences and then that you have as a cadet around those strengths and start to build confidence. But
Mm.
Strength Finder will definitely give you that confidence because if you know what your strengths are and then you reflect on some of the things at the institute that you did that really were your high points that you think memorably about, you can see where your strengths flowed in those. And then when you sit down either with your first commander or you sit down with a manager when you get hired or do a job interview, you can tell stories on how those strengths applied for you and how you were able to effectively kind of drive outcomes based on those. And that's critical. And for me, Woo is one of those strengths that I love because it's about just talking to people you don't necessarily know. And I just find people interesting. So I love just talking to a lot of different people. And I'm the person who will go to a cocktail party, never eat anything, and just kind of work the room and then really enjoy myself. And part of what I talk about in Strength Finder too is where you draw your energy. So for me, I love talking to people I don't know, and I draw a lot of energy from that. And that's also important Strength Finder. How do you keep your energy levels up?
Yeah.
Looking at those strengths. So for me, it was one of those things that does it for me.
Mhm. Well, we certainly all benefit from you having that kind of character and strength. We're talking about the leadership and organizations class, and that's where they explore all kinds of leadership theories and then do some studies. And some sections actually create a leader profile about themselves, and they take this Strength Finders assessment. Would you say that that closely falls in line with or can evolve into a commander's intent?
I think it can, from the sense that for the commander, if they use Strength Finder and they look at their Strength Finder, then what they're doing is as they're shaping their commander's intent, their mindset is I'm getting the best version of each person to be the best they can be by looking at their strengths and then also theirs and kind of bringing them together to kind of achieve those goals and objectives. And then also, if for some reason there's a gap in there, because diversity of your strengths is critical for an organization.
Yeah.
So you don't want 20 Christmas, then we're all going to just shake our head and go, oh, that's great. That's the best idea I've ever heard. You want those diversity of strengths to help you get to a better solution, which is really critical. So the idea is if I can create my commander's intent based on the best versions each person I have, and then if I have a gap, go find some people to fill that gap, or just put in processes in place to make sure I kind of think about those things we don't necessarily have. Because ideally, you get who you want, but that's not reality. Sometimes you're going to have a gap. That'll help you with the commander's intent. And then you optimize the organization to be the best they can. They increase morale and a sense of accomplishment and drive, which is really important.
I'd like you to talk a little bit more about how this leader profile, Strength Finders, relates to your strategy of developing recruitable subordinates and tie it into that 80-20 rule.
Yeah, so I'll take the second part first. So that part goes to what I call my command philosophy, which is I know that we have a great organization if the people in my organization are being recruited to other parts of the organization. So there's two elements to that. One is that I am honored that they're being recruited because it talks to the culture of the organization we have and not the leader. Because if it was just about the leader, you wouldn't have that. And Liz Weissman has a book called Multipliers, which talks about diminishers and multipliers. And that's what a diminisher does. It's all about them. But to be
Mm,
recruited means that the culture of your organization that you're leading is naturally a place where it's developing future leaders for other parts of the organization. And there's a great book called What Got Us There Won't Get You There.
mm,
And the whole idea was from Marshall Goldsmith was that you have to evolve to where the success of the organization is beyond where you are. So you want to help everybody with everything all the time, whether it's your talent, your ideas, everything. So my philosophy has always been I know that we have a good organization if you get recruited away. And that's what I focus on. The other thing to be careful of with young leaders is, and this is where you can see it as a trap sometimes, is the leader won't let their subordinates develop. So they won't send them to school because they're just too valuable. I can't lose them.
mm,
And
mhm.
that's a very I centric mindset because if I'm trying to get the best version of everyone, it's for the organization, not myself. So I want to have those people develop, have those opportunities, do those things, and move on. Will I miss them? Absolutely. But if I've done a good job developing everybody in the organization, someone will step up from that side. But we have to be very careful that we don't get selfish with very talented people. We want to have them keep growing. So with the Pareto principle, which is 20% of what you do is responsible for 80% of your success, that's really the heart of what coaching's about, and figuring out, okay, what am I really good at? And then doing more of that. So when I coach people, I try to identify what are those key things that you're good at, and then have you do more of them. And that's how I'm able to have people be more successful. And when you go into the organizational aspects of it, it's figuring out, okay, what are we good at? And then what are the gaps we might have that we need to go from good to great on, and kind of executing to those within that 20%, and then staying focused on it, which is critical from that side. But it's a powerful, very powerful tool that I use with very successful people, because we always assume if you're really successful, you must be working great. And I'll have them just write down every hour what they do.
Oh, yeah,
And I've
the
always
time
had them come
study.
back. Yeah, I always had them come back and they're like, "Oh my God, I can't believe how much time I wasted." And that's one side of it. The other side of it is think about how comfortable it is to know that these are the things that are most important. So if I come
Mhm.
into my day and know these 5 things are the things I need to accomplish every day, and everything else is interesting, but it's only going to be 20% more of the success, it just makes you more effective as an individual. And then as a leader as well. As a leader, if I know the 20% things I need to focus on, that allows me to do that. And I also do it for work life balance with families in the military as well as other ones. Because if you know that 20% for your relationships or other things, that allows you to get things done and focus very quickly. And if you have to leave or whatever, you got the most important things done.
So what kind of, assessment tools, if any, do you use to identify the gaps, would you say?
So what I do is I do a strategic assessment of the organization, usually over the first 45 days. I interview the leaders and then also the people who work in various aspects of the business. So it's not just the leaders because they'll kind of give you the company line. I want to talk to everybody. I'll also look at industry trends and see, okay, where's this
Mm,
industry going? So like in my
mhm,
previous job, it was all about the client experience for a lot of reasons, regulatory,
mm,
obviously the client and some others. So looking at that and then looking at kind of where we're at, doing your classic SWOT analysis is
mhm,
important. You need to understand those things. And a lot of industries are not looking at the macro trends. Because you're going to have peaks and troughs, you're going to have regulatory things come in, you're going to have economic cycles. All those things matter when I kind of look at things to figure out where we need to go, and then getting that unified purpose, which is that trust and communications we talked about, where we all are on the same line with that committer's intent, that vision, then allows us to execute and stay focused. And
mhm,
the key thing as a leader is not to change the message.
mhm.
Success is defined by your people knowing exactly what they need to do every day. And if you keep changing the message, then they don't know what to do. But if you stay focused, they will execute at a very high level and then innovate around whatever that vision is.
So one of my top leadership books is one by a lady named Denise Leon, and it's, called Brand Fusion. Have you heard of her?
I've heard of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and she talked about operationalizing your brand.
Yep.
And so when you talk about taking your, using your vision, leveraging that so that everybody knows, not to change the message. What is our message? I like her work and how she builds that into the operations. You're going to be giving the keynote speech at the superintendent's annual leadership dinner. And while I don't want to cannibalize your content for that, what topic will you be talking about?
So I'm going to talk a lot about how VMI is a crucible for leadership, innovation, and adaptation. And the idea being that, what keeps me up at night when I think about the world is it's innovating faster and faster. So we think about the technology all the time and go, wow, this is amazing. I've got an Apple Watch, I've got this, I've got that. Well, the thing is, you need leaders who can adapt to those changes and make sure they get integrated in. So a simple one is if we go back to COVID, you had Zoom, then you had Microsoft Teams, and a lot of people didn't learn the technology because just kept coming. And a leader needs to make sure they inspire their people to do that. And what's critical in today's world is that we have to help those leaders become that type of leader. Because when I was going through my initial leadership training, you had time to make decisions. And the problem is your brain is designed to survive, not thrive. And the hard part about today's leaders versus when I started is I could sit on a decision for a period of time and then make it literally months later and not have any consequences be against me. Whereas today, leaders have to be much more dynamic and leading in because technology is moving faster. So they need to make sure their subordinates have it. In a nightmare scenario for me is a technology gets rolled out to a military unit, and they're so busy and they're so comfortable in the technology they have, the leader doesn't create a change in the status quo and say, no, we need to learn this new technology. And then it leads to them having a setback on the battlefield. And it's the same in the corporate world, because in the corporate world, you have to constantly be evolving. And if you miss, then that means you're going to have to make a bet in the future because you didn't come up with 2.0. Now you're going to bet on 3.0. And that's a risky challenge. So leaders today need to be constantly leaning forward. And there is no, 10-year success of a product anymore. It's literally a couple years, and then you better come up with a new version. So, I joke a lot about the Post-it note because that was a great thing, right? We still use it. But you can see tablets and other things come in, and younger generations don't use those things, but these cycles change. And there was a great example last week, 23andMe was this, DNA thing that was really hot, was a $6 billion company, and now it's zero because it didn't figure out what is next that comes after that. And that's the reality we live in. So we need leaders who can do that. And VMI is a place where you have that laboratory to give them the opportunity to constantly innovate and keep changing and thinking and practicing while they're at this institute, and then also go out into the civilian world or the military and be that successful leader because they know that they have to keep changing and innovating and also yet have the principles that VMI stands for.
Is there such a thing as future proofing? Or is there just, a particular mindset that helps one to keep evolving?
That's a great question. And I do a lot of wargaming and
Uh,
simulations as in my other role as a senior advisor for the Regular Warfare Center. And part of what we talk about is the elasticity of the mind. So just thinking about different opportunities then opens you up to thinking about them. Whereas if you don't do that, you don't have that elasticity of thinking. So, Bill Gates, who was Secretary of Defense, once said that, futurists have never been right. But I don't think it's so much about them being right as it's about creating a mindset of thinking about constant change and being aware of that. And as you move up, as a strategic leader, my role was to think out 3 to 5 years on where the organization needed to be. And as a tactical leader, it's weeks out because just the nature of tactical versus strategic. But also the compression of that is coming to where now I even say at the strategic level, it's like 18 months because everything's
yeah.
moving faster and faster. So for those leaders, that's hard. That's really hard. And I talk about Ukraine with the cadets and the Special Operations Task Force commanders, which are colonels in special forces. I've talked to three of them or four of them at this point, and they all say the war changes every 60 days. So as a leader, thinking about that is a challenge. So that it's one of those things we just have to train people to be more and more agile and leaning in on.
And is there a difference, or can you describe the difference between having an agile mindset, maybe a resilient mindset, and change management?
Mhm. So agile is really about getting it out and executing it and developing and innovating. So kind of going back to strength finder, I'm a learner and an input. So
Mm,
that's what I do. I look, I develop that plan, I get that plan out there, but then I'm constantly changing it because I wasn't looking
mm.
for the perfect plan to come out. It's more of that kind of agile concept of it's 60%, but the field's going to tell me what I need to do to kind of upskill it from there. So a resilient mindset to me is about the ability to handle the pressure of changing all the time, and then also being comfortable in taking those risks,
Mm,
which is really about you being resilient and realizing, okay, everything's moving faster and faster. But it's also about leaders looking and saying, and I always said this as part of my leadership philosophy, we're moving fast, so we're going to have an error rate. And
yeah.
the key with that error rate is that we learn from it. But for us to be resilient, I can't put pressure on my team to where they feel like, oh gosh, we're a zero defect organization. Because when that happens, then nothing happens. And that's unfortunately what we had in the past in the military. We had this kind of zero defect mentality, which led to kind of more of a stalled out organization and development.
Mm.
And then change management is really about again thinking about where do we need to go? What do we need to be thinking about to get the best versions of our folks and realizing it's not static. They are constantly evolving, the technology around them is evolving that will make them better, and then the trends and industry are evolving, so you have to constantly have this change management mindset of always going from good to great
Mm.
and not thinking, okay, we're good, because if you think you've made it and you're maintaining the status quo, the reality is you're going backwards. You're just not seeing it because it's very slow, and eventually you're going to get in trouble, and you'll see that it might be too late for you to recover.
Can we train for resilience?
We can, because it's one of those things that's actually kind of fascinating. I've been doing a lot of reading on this where it's kind of like parachute jumping. The first time you jump out of a plane,
Really?
you're scared to death.
Okay.
And then the more you do it, the more comfortable you get. So we can train various resilience scenarios. And then also it's key for the leader to basically develop their folks and not look at something as, oh my gosh, I can't believe you did that. That's such a big mistake. And put pressure on them instead of looking at it as a learning opportunity to develop the organization. And resilience is critical,
Mhm.
because for us to be able to move forward in the future, we are going to make more and more mistakes because we're moving faster and faster. So it's the ability to snap back immediately and get back into the game. And that's where that resiliency is really going to come into play.
It's interesting that resilience requires a certain error rate. How do you determine what successful looks like? How do you determine what is a successful error rate?
That's a great question. And I think it's one that we are coming to grips with and realizing that failure leads to success. So there is a person I used to play golf with who's a four-star general who moved up in actually was in a pretty senior position, and we would talk about failing faster. And the
Mm,
idea of failing faster is that the faster you fail, the faster you get to that next breakthrough in innovation. And that's kind of how I look at errors, because if you're on the cutting edge and you're pushing forward, you're going to have those errors. And then those errors going to lead to learning opportunities for you then to advance from. So the idea being that if I don't have errors, then I'm probably not taking enough of a risk to grow the organization to the next level. And that's critical. And it's the same. I always talk about friction in an organization. If you
mm,
don't have friction, your organization isn't growing. And it's not that you don't want everybody to like each other, but it's the idea that organizationally we're leaning in, and you don't make it personal, but you just talk about how do we challenge the status quo? Where should we be going next to kind of create that friction? And I look at errors that same way. We need to have those errors to be able to be successful. And I've had the opportunity a couple times to talk to biographers, and that's one of the things they look at in developing leaders. You have to have mistakes to learn from to grow as a leader. And the ones biographers are always worried about are the ones who've had no mistakes who think they're perfect,
Mm,
because that is a scary idea as well, because then you have blind spots that you don't realize. So
mhm.
how having errors, how you treat those errors, and how you grow from them are critical for you and your organization.
So I like that was another discussion we had. As a team, we're actually in the season right now. We're February of looking at what will be our leadership theme for next year, and then what will we delve into for our leadership conference. And so we talked about, failure is a fairly big buzzword in industry and business. It's been out there for several years now. And we were talking about, maybe we don't call it failure, but we call it learning mechanisms, right? I mean, that's really what you're talking about. And I remember
Yeah.
in college, we talked about experimentation being a hallmark of intelligence. That if you see a child trying to learn how to walk, it's experimenting with its balance to learn how to walk, how to talk. That was just a side note of conversation we were having.
Yeah, it's a great point because as I build plans for organizations to that Pareto principle, we're making a hypothetical experiment with a line of effort, and we put metrics, both qualitative and quantitative, against it. But I always tell people, don't get wed to your plan. If the
Mhm.
metrics are showing that your idea, what you thought was a 20% thing that would lead to 80% of your success, isn't working, then change the plan. It's not a
Right.
failure. The metrics allowed you to say, hey, this isn't working. Let's try something else. So you have to have that experimentation mindset, as opposed to, I have the best idea ever. And then you just hold that forever, and it leads to failure instead of using it as an opportunity to change.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of, somebody sent me the book, Who Moved the Cheese or Who Moved My Cheese?
That's a good one.
Um, so we're about out of time, and,
Yep.
I think we've gone over some really great, content. This conversations with people who operate at your level are just so fascinating to me because the episodes and the discussions we have are just chock full of meaty information and takeaways. Do you have any final words? Again, you've been here for a while. You've kind of observed our leadership methods and the results, having conversations with cadets. Any final thoughts or insights on the experience you've had?
Yeah, I would say one, it's been incredibly humbling for me, and I tell the cadets all the time. I joined back in 1983 as an E1, and every one of them, which is striking as I ask, now were born around 2000. So they were born in a time of conflict after 9/11,
Mhm.
and they've grown up in elementary school and middle school and high school, and have still made a decision to serve their country, our country, either in the military or in other agencies or as a leader, and have come to VMI. So that's incredibly humbling to me, because when I joined in 83, as I mentioned, I wanted to serve my country. And also it gave me an opportunity to get my college paid for. And I was very sober in the reality, if I have to go to war, I will.
Yeah.
But they joined during the time of war. And I always tell them, as much as I've done and accomplished in the military, I don't know if I would have made that decision, because I haven't been put in that space. But that's a much bigger decision than Chris Burns saying, "Okay, I'm going to join for 6 months, 6 years, and serve in the National Guard." So I'm very proud of them and humbled by their commitment to serve, and then their ability to be on the cutting edge of leadership innovation as the world gets faster and faster,
Mm.
in figuring out how to do that, to me, is incredibly exciting. As I sit, and help and advise and do all these things, they're at that tactical level, having to kind of make these changes faster and faster. So that is exciting to me, to watch them as they learn, as they develop. And just like with officer candidate school, my greatest joy will be when I run into them at a base someplace, and they're a captain or a major, and they tell me about how what they learned at VMI helped them to be very successful as a leader in the future, whether it's in a corporation or in the military. So that's to me, but it's really exciting about where they're going in the future they have.
Well, I certainly hope you have plenty of those opportunities, and I hope that VMI continues to stay in touch with you and leverage your insights and expertise. I know I certainly will. And so I've really enjoyed our time today. I could definitely go on for another couple of hours, but we're not the Joe Rogan show.
Yeah.
Uh, but I thank you so much for your time and for all that you're contributing to examining what we do here at VMI and your insights and conversations you've been having.
And thank you, Catherine, and the entire team at the Center for Leadership and Ethics. It's been an honor, and I love the workshops. You guys do an amazing job, which is how I met everybody coming to one of your workshops. So which was fantastic. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay.